I have a Vizio model number M55-E0, and when I plug it in, I actually get no standby, so no power. Typically, we're supposed to be seeing a little white light there, and then we can go ahead and turn it on, and we get a picture. So we don't get a standby light. However, sometimes a common fault we do see is the standby light does show up, and pressing the power button doesn't do anything, it just doesn't turn on. So let's go ahead and open it up and find out what the problem is. We just removed the back cover. If you don't know how to do that, we'll have a video in the top right corner you can check out. Otherwise, we're gonna go ahead and plug it back in, recheck our symptoms, and do a little bit of troubleshooting here. So rechecking here, we still don't have our standby light. So I'm gonna try something, and this is not how we fix it, but it is how we troubleshoot the TV. I'm gonna use this hot air to heat up the main processor chip on the main board. And we're gonna be doing about 15 to 20 seconds or so. All right, that's been about 20 seconds. Now let's go ahead and plug the TV back in. And let's take a look at the standby light here. And nothing is happening. Okay. So it doesn't always work on the first try. So let's go ahead and disconnect the power. We'll go ahead and do a second round of heating. So we're gonna go ahead and plug it back in. Take a look, and we do have our standby lights. Once it fades, we're gonna press the power button. So this is actually something that we also commonly see is we do get our standby light, but when we power it on, we get no picture on screen. So we did get the standby light to come back, but we're still not getting picture on screen. Now, the heating trick does not always work, and it's more used as a diagnostic tool. It's not a repair, of course, so even if we did have pictures showing up on screen and everything was working, that is not how we fix it. That we will show you here in just a second. All right, so we just did a third round of heating up in the hopes of getting the TV to turn on, just to show you guys that we can get it to show picture. We just wait a little bit more time, so let's go ahead and plug it back in. So we do have our standby light. Let's take a look at the screen. Power on, there we go. Okay, so now we have picture. We have our HDMI 2, which is what it's currently set at. We can bring up our menu. So it looks like we temporarily have it working. So the reason I say temporarily is because if I turn it off and let it sit for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, a couple hours, and I come back to turn it on, it probably will not work anymore. So now let's go ahead and bring it to the bench and actually do a correct repair.
If you don't know how to remove your main board, you can check out the video on the right-hand corner over here. So we're gonna begin by removing the pad from the back. I'm gonna be using 350 for the temperature and 100 air. So I'm using hot air right now, and we're gonna start by prying up the thermal pad just a little bit on the corners. You wanna aim for removing the adhesive portion from the board. You gotta be careful. And you just do it nice and slow. I'm using hot air to loosen the adhesive from the main board, because this sticky pad really gets stuck on there. And obviously I'm using a prying tool so that I don't burn my finger. And there we go. Just move this to the side, and now we're going to remove the heatsink and see what we have underneath. If we were to leave the pad on the main board while we do a reflow, what would happen is the pad would stick on here, and once we reach a certain temperature on the BGA machine, it would pull all these capacitors with it, and that would leave a whole lot of work for us to do later on. And I'm also removing all the plastic pieces because we don't want those to melt while we're performing our rework on this board. And so there's what it looks like, and let's begin. The reason we're using the BGA machine instead of this hot air is because we want to focus our heat on this BGA, but we also don't want the board to start warping, and we want even heat. So how we do that, or how we achieve that, is we have bottom heat from our plates here, but we also have a more focused bottom heat right here that will focus on the back of the BGA. And then we have our top heat, of course, which essentially is just like the hot air wand, but it's far more controlled and centered on the particular chip we want to work on. And then the reason we're using a BGA machine versus using just a soldering iron is that there's no way we can get underneath this BGA with the soldering iron. You'd have to use hot air so that you can make the solder that's underneath a certain temperature so that you can remove the chip. We have our bottom heat set to where it's almost pressing up against the board. Now we just wait. So we're gonna go ahead and prod it and see. Oh, it looks like it's moving. Looks like we're ready to remove the chip. All right, we're gonna begin by adding some flux to help remove this old solder. Bring out the old trusty spatula tip here. And I'm just barely running the spatula tip on the very top of all the solder. I'm not really pressing down on the board. It kind of floats like butter on a skillet. And now we're going to be using the desoldering braid to remove any excess solder that may remain, which of course there was plenty that's remaining. And once again, I'm not really pressing hard on this. We're just barely running lightly on top of the board. All right, and now we're going to clean up the spent flux that's on the board with some alcohol. All right, it's nice and clean. So the reason that we remove the chip is so that we can put some new solder balls on here. The reason for that is because these solder balls get micro fractures on them.
And because of that, we're going to put new solder, which is lead based, and that'll be a lot more resilient to the temperature fluctuations that'll happen when this board is in use by the TV.
So we're going to begin by adding some flux to this chip, and that'll aid in the removal of the old solder. And once again, I'm just floating the spatula tip on the top of the BGA. I'm not really pressing very hard, and I'm just gathering as much of the old solder as I can on the tip. And now we're going to use the desoldering braid now that our tip is cleaned off a little bit of the old solder. And once again, I'm just going to run that over the top of the BGA. I'm not pressing very hard. All right, we've removed all of the old solder. Now we're going to go ahead and clean off the chip. Clean this an additional time just to make sure we got all the spent flux. I happen to already have a stencil for this particular BGA. I think it requires the 0.5 millimeter solder balls. We're going to begin by adding a little bit of flux to the BGA. Just spread that around with our brush here. All right, we're going to add our stencil on here. And I believe there's a certain way this one goes on. Let me go ahead and double check. All right, and there we go. All right, now we'll begin by adding our solder balls. Just want to brush off the excess here. And there'll be a couple that we need to fill in. Once again, wiping off the excess. Alright, looks like we got them all. Now we'll go ahead and use some hot air to attach these little solder balls to the BGA. For my particular setup, I'm going to use 340 air. Your mileage may vary depending on where you are in the world and your humidity and whatnot. Now I find that sometimes you may even have to go lower than that for the air pressure because some of these solder balls like to pop out of their holes when we're dealing with the 0.5. And you pretty much want to go in an even circular motion around the BGA. If you focus too much in one area, you could end up having a lot of solder balls explode out. We want to try and minimize that as much as possible. It looks like we're pretty much at temperature now that the flux is smoking. And you just want to make quick passes and then level it off to where you're going nice and slow. You'll start seeing the solder balls sink in and you'll know that they're attached. Plus they'll become a little bit more shiny and look a little wet. And you don't want to be on this chip for too long because then you will pop it and then you'll have to replace it. Now I'm going to perform a little bit of a visual inspection on this chip to make sure every single solder ball sunk in. There's a good chance that most of them didn't, and I'll have to apply some more heat to it. Alright, looks pretty good so far, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a couple that come up with the stencil. We'll find out in a minute here once this thing cools down a little bit. Alright, we'll go ahead and separate the stencil from the BGA. I usually just do that with my fingernail, which you can't see under the glove. And there we are. Looks like a pretty clean removal. Let's go ahead and visually inspect this BGA, make sure that there are no missing solder balls and that everything looks like it's attached properly. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. I think I will go over it one more time with a little bit of heat to make sure everything is attached properly. Yeah, there were a couple that looked like they weren't really straight. All right, now we'll let that cool for a minute or so, and then we'll begin the reattachment process. All right, I guess while we wait for this BGA to cool down, we'll go ahead and clean up the heat sink of this old thermal paste that's encrusted on here. I am using an X-Acto blade here, but we can also use any kind of tool that you have that's flat. I have this spatula, which you can use to just scratch the top here. And you do want to make sure you get all of the old thermal paste off and have the heatsink as clean as possible. That way the new paste that you put on here will have good thermal transfer. And we'll go ahead and add some of this guy on here. It's a little bit more than rice grain amount. All right, now that is prepped. You can go ahead and clean the top of the BGA of the old thermal paste that was on here as well. I usually like to use a brush, and I've added some alcohol to help dissipate or loosen up the old thermal paste. It's not going to really remove all of it, so I'll probably have to go ahead and scratch a little bit, either with a toothpick or a metal tool. I would advise a toothpick just because you could end up slipping and damaging some of the traces on this BGA. But for some of this old thermal paste, you may have no choice. Just as long as you clean the top of the die, that should be fine. All right, that should work right there. All right, we're gonna add some more flux to this board. Just go ahead and spread that around before we put the Reballing BGA on here. You wanna do your best to cover all the corners with the flux. So I don't know if you can see it right there, but there's a little gold triangle. And that's what we're gonna use to match up right here. Because the pattern on the bottom of the chip will match right there. All right, so we're gonna put the BGA down now that we've confirmed our orientation. And you kind of want to just move the BGA around a little bit until it locks in. So you see I can't really move it from left to right unless I really put a lot of force on there. You just want to make sure you're within the white lines, and that should be good. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but there is a white line right here that defines the border of where the chip is supposed to lay. So not this line, but the one right here with all the letters. And it goes all the way around the BGA. And those are the lines you want to stay within when you put the BGA back on. We're going to start up the BGA machine so we can reattach this chip. It's all properly aligned and ready to go. All right, we're starting it up. All right, it looks like the machine is about to hit temperature here. The solder balls look like they're glistening and they're nice and shiny. So yeah, we just reached temperature and it's going to cool down now. All right, looks like the board is done. We're going to go ahead and attach this heatsink back onto it, and you'll notice that of course we already have our new thermal paste and the die has been cleaned. All right, looks like the board is all done, and we're going to hand this back over to Nick.
So we've installed the board back into the TV, and I actually put a Fire Stick into the HDMI port 2 that it was set to prior. And we do have our standby light, so let's wait about a minute or so. Typically when you first plug these in, it does take a little bit of time before you can actually power it up. All right, let's go ahead and give it a shot. And we have our Vizio logo, and we're on HDMI 2. And our Fire Stick is powering up. So we have good picture. Seems the TV is working properly. If you found the video helpful or useful, leave us a like and subscribe. And thank you for watching.